Alicia adjusted her glasses, taking in the glimmering lights and polished floors as she stepped into Le Couron, her newest acquisition. From the outside, the place was immaculate, every detail perfectly orchestrated to capture the sophistication of the clientele it aimed to attract. Dressed in jeans and a casual sweater, Alicia knew she'd likely be underestimated. That was the plan. She'd built her reputation on understanding people and environments from the ground up, and Le Couron would be no exception. Just as she was scanning the dining room, Brian approached. Tall, slim, and impeccably groomed, he had the practiced demeanor of someone who considered himself the gatekeeper of elegance. He took one look at Alicia, his eyes narrowing slightly, lips pressed in a thin line. "Can I help you?" His voice had a tightness to it, the kind reserved for unwelcome guests. Alicia could feel his gaze flick over her, taking in her casual attire with thinly veiled contempt. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I'd like a table by the window." Brian's brows arched, surprise quickly giving way to a smirk that only deepened his already visible disdain. He cleared his throat, voice dropping as he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm not sure this establishment suits you." Alicia held his gaze, not flinching. "I think I'll decide what suits me." Brian's jaw tightened, and he exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said, motioning her toward a corner table, not the window seat she'd requested. "Right this way?" He led her to a small, cramped table, wedged between the server's station and a potted plant. Alicia glanced at the narrow space, unfazed. "This isn't by the window," she pointed out, her tone even. "It's what we have for unexpected guests," Brian replied with a thin smile, his voice a shade colder. "Perhaps you might find it comfortable." Alicia's eyes didn't leave his face. "I'm happy to wait for the window seat." Brian's sigh was exaggerated, his exasperation on full display. He looked around, as if daring someone else to intervene. A few tables over, patrons shifted in their seats, glancing at Alicia and then quickly looking away. Alicia noticed their silent discomfort, the way people often avoided eye contact during uncomfortable situations, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. After a tense pause, Brian shrugged and walked off without a word, leaving her standing by the table. Alicia took her time sitting down, adjusting her napkin and gazing out at the dining room. She knew exactly what he was trying to accomplish, and she wasn't about to make it easy for him. Brian returned, this time with a menu, which he dropped onto the table with a sharp clatter. He didn't bother opening it for her, nor did he offer any suggestions. "Whenever you're ready," he muttered, already stepping back. Alicia held up the menu and scanned the options, pretending to deliberate. "What's the chef's recommendation tonight?" she asked casually. Brian's mouth twisted into a mocking smile. "Well, we have several options, but I'm not sure they're within your preference range." Alicia didn't miss a beat. "Why don't you surprise me? Bring me the chef's best," she said, handing him the menu. Brian hesitated, the challenge in her eyes catching him off guard. But he quickly regained his composure, sneering as he glanced down at her. "Very well," he muttered, and left without another word. From her table, Alicia noticed the subtle glances from the waitstaff, the way they whispered to each other, some of them amused, others shifting uncomfortably. She could feel the quiet judgment and the assumption that she was somehow out of place. But the only person out of place here, Alicia thought, was Brian, with his unbridled arrogance. Several minutes passed before he returned, this time with a single glass of water that he placed down with a little too much force. "For now," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Thank you," Alicia replied, her voice steady. She sipped her water calmly, feeling the weight of the room's attention as Brian loomed, clearly expecting her to break or walk away. But Alicia remained seated, letting the seconds stretch in silence until Brian finally walked off, visibly irritated. It wasn't long before he returned with a plate, a small salad, nothing more. "Here's something light," he sneered, setting the plate in front of her without a hint of decorum. Alicia examined the salad, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I appreciate the gesture," she said smoothly, "but I think I'll go for something more substantial. The filet mignon, perhaps?" Brian's face tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his eyes. He let out a low, almost inaudible scoff. You might find that a bit extravagant, he murmured, the subtle jab unmistakable. Then it's a good thing I'm in the mood for extravagance, Alicia replied, her tone cool. Brian stared at her, clearly caught off guard by her poise. But before he could respond, a figure approached their table. John, the manager. His face brightened as he recognized Alicia, his posture immediately respectful. Ms. Pearson, he greeted her warmly, extending a hand. It's wonderful to finally see you here in person. The color drained from Brian's face, his expression shifting from arrogance to pure shock. His eyes darted from John to Alicia, realization sinking in. Alicia accepted John's handshake, her gaze never leaving Brian. John, she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. I was just getting acquainted with the staff. John's eyes flicked to Brian, who stood frozen, his confidence shattered. Alicia took a slow breath, meeting Brian's wide-eyed stare. I was hoping to see how guests are treated here, she continued, her tone steady. And I have to say, it's been eye-opening. Brian stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't realize. That much is clear, Alicia replied, cutting him off, her calm gaze unwavering. But it's fortunate I had the chance to experience your unique style of hospitality firsthand. With every word, Brian seemed to shrink, his earlier bravado now a shadow. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out, leaving him standing in silence as Alicia looked around the room, aware of every eye watching. The air in Le Couronne felt tense and brittle as John, the manager, remained at Alicia's side, eyes darting between her and Brian, whose confidence was in tatters. Alicia could see him struggling to piece together a response, as if desperately searching for a way to rewrite what had just happened. Alicia, John began with a smile, attempting to break the silence. If I'd known you were stopping by, we would have been prepared to show you the full experience. Oh, I think I've seen quite enough of the experience, Alicia replied, her voice calm yet resolute. Her eyes met Brian's, unflinching. I was hoping to understand how the team here treats every guest, not just those who look, well, let's say, suitable to someone like Brian. John's face tightened slightly as he caught her meaning. He turned to Brian, gesturing for him to speak. Brian? Anything you'd like to say to Ms. Pearson? Brian's mouth opened and closed, his face pale. The other servers watched from a distance, none daring to step closer. Finally, he managed a few stammered words. Ms. Pearson, I'd apologize if I seemed rude, he muttered, barely able to meet her eyes. Rude is one word, Alicia replied, arching an eyebrow. But I'm wondering, Brian, why the hesitation in treating me, or anyone else, with the same courtesy as other guests? Brian shifted uncomfortably, searching for an answer. I just didn't realize who you were, he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought maybe you were here, for other reasons. Other reasons? Alicia's voice was steady, but her gaze was unyielding. You mean you assumed I didn't belong here because of how I looked? Is that it? Brian's face flushed red, and he struggled for words. It wasn't about that, he blurted, though his voice lacked conviction. We're used to a certain type of clientele here. Alicia's eyes narrowed. A certain type? She let the words hang in the air, giving everyone around a moment to understand what that meant. The weight of her gaze silenced Brian completely, and he lowered his head, unable to maintain his defiance. John cleared his throat, sensing the tension. Ms. Pearson, he said, we want to assure you that Le Couronne strives to welcome everyone who walks through our doors. Brian may have misjudged the situation, but I can promise this isn't the standard we aim for. Alicia tilted her head, studying him. John, I appreciate your commitment to professionalism, she said. But from what I experienced today, it seems like we're far from that standard. The words hit John hard, and he nodded slowly, looking down in acknowledgement. Alicia turned back to Brian, her gaze unwavering. Tell me, Brian, how long have you been working here? 10 years, he replied softly, his voice barely audible. 10 years, Alicia repeated thoughtfully. That's a long time to spend in a place where you don't think everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Don't you think? Brian's face flushed, and he swallowed hard. I understand, he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "Good," Alicia said, her voice softening, though her tone remained firm. "Because here's what I'm expecting moving forward. Respect. For every single person who steps into this restaurant, regardless of who they are, what they're wearing, or what assumptions you might have." Brian nodded, visibly deflated. The other servers watched intently, glancing at each other, absorbing her words. Alicia noticed a few of them exchanging uneasy looks, as if realizing that this wasn't just a message for Brian, but a standard she intended to set across the board. John stepped forward, attempting to regain some control of the situation. "Ms. Pearson, please allow me to personally ensure the quality of your experience tonight. We'll take care of every detail." Alicia's gaze softened, though her resolve remained intact. "Thank you, John," she replied, "but I'm more interested in how things are managed here when I'm not around." She looked around the room, her voice loud enough for the entire team to hear. "Tonight isn't just about making sure I have a nice meal. It's about showing everyone, every single guest who walks in, that they are valued without exception." John nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of her words. Brian, still standing nearby, seemed smaller somehow, as if the realization of his actions had finally sunk in. Alicia took a breath, relaxing her posture slightly. As she took her seat at the table, she watched as Brian slunk away, avoiding eye contact with both her and his colleagues. There was a sense of silent judgment among the other staff members, a few of them shaking their heads, others glancing nervously at Alicia as if hoping to avoid her scrutiny. John returned moments later, bringing her a carefully plated entree himself. "We'll be refining our training standards immediately," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "This won't happen again, Ms. Pearson." Alicia looked up at him, offering a slight nod. "I'll be holding you to that," she replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "Not just for me, John. For every single person who comes through these doors." John swallowed, his respect for her clear in his gaze. "Understood." As Alicia took her first bite, she felt the tension in the room begin to ease, the other servers returning to their routines. But the evening had changed the atmosphere at Le Couron. For her, for Brian, and for the entire staff. Alicia's meal proceeded with a calm that belied the earlier tension, but she sensed the simmering unease in the room. Staff members hustled around her table with newfound caution, and diners glanced her way, murmuring. The ripple effect of the earlier scene had clearly left its mark. Alicia took a slow sip of her water, allowing herself a moment to savor the impact. She had come here to understand the restaurant's environment, and now she saw the challenge that lay ahead more clearly than ever. Brian, meanwhile, had returned to the floor, but maintained a distance. He moved with a nervous energy, his posture stiff, his face still flushed from embarrassment. Alicia noticed him throwing quick glances her way, as though he was bracing himself for a further confrontation. She let him simmer in his own discomfort, observing how he interacted with other guests. He was trying hard, but there was an unmistakable tension, a forced politeness that couldn't fully mask his irritation. Just as she was finishing her entree, John returned to her table with a small, nervous smile. "Miss Pearson, how was the filet?" he asked, his tone deferential. "Delicious," she replied. "Thank you for your attentiveness tonight, John." John let out a small breath of relief, nodding. "I'm glad. And please know that we take tonight's experience very seriously." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room. "I'd like to have a word with Brian again before I leave. In private." John's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. I'll let him know." A few minutes later, Alicia was guided to a small, private office in the back. The room was functional, with a modest desk, a single chair, and a few certificates on the wall, mostly awards the restaurant had won under previous ownership. She waited a moment before Brian entered, his shoulders hunched and his expression wary. He lingered near the doorway, as if unsure whether to sit or stand. "Close the door, please," Alicia instructed gently. He obeyed, stepping fully into the room and finally taking the seat across from her. Silence filled the space, thick and unyielding. Alicia regarded him carefully, letting the weight of the moment settle before speaking. "Brian," she began, her voice measured, "I want you to tell me, Why did you treat me that way tonight? Brian fidgeted, his fingers clenching and unclenching as he avoided her gaze. I didn't know you were the owner, he muttered, his voice barely audible. That much is clear, Alicia replied calmly. But what I'm asking is, why did you assume that I was someone who didn't deserve basic respect? Brian's gaze flicked up briefly, then dropped again, his expression pained. I guess. I thought you might be looking for a handout, he admitted, his voice filled with an odd mix of shame and defensiveness. Alicia studied him, her silence pressing him to continue. It's just, I've been here a long time, he said, finally meeting her eyes, a trace of defiance mingling with his shame. I've seen all kind of people come through those doors. I thought I could tell who was serious about dining here, and who was just... He trailed off, struggling for words. Who was just what? Alicia prompted, her voice soft yet unyielding. Who didn't belong here? He finished in a whisper, his face reddening as the admission hung in the air. Alicia felt a pang of frustration, tempered by a deeper understanding. She could see his insecurity, his need to assert some measure of control in his small corner of the world. But that didn't excuse his behavior. Brian, she said slowly, you've been here for 10 years, correct? He nodded, his eyes dropping again. Do you want to continue working here? He looked up, startled. Of course I do, he replied quickly. This job, it's important to me. It's my livelihood. Then understand this, Alicia said, her tone firm. This restaurant, under my ownership, will not tolerate discrimination or assumptions based on appearance. Every person who walks in deserves the same level of respect. Whether they're wearing a suit or jeans, whether they're dining alone or in a group. Brian swallowed, his face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. I understand, Ms. Pearson, he said, his voice low. I made a mistake. Alicia let his words sink in before responding. Mistakes happen, but this isn't just about one night, Brian. It's about a mindset, a way of viewing people. And that's something you need to address if you're going to stay here. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words visibly settling on him. I understand, he said quietly. I hope you do, Alicia replied. Because moving forward, I'll be implementing new training programs to ensure that everyone here aligns with the values I want this place to represent. Respect, inclusion, empathy. I'll expect you to be the first one to set that example. Brian's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Alicia thought she saw a flicker of gratitude. Thank you for the chance, Ms. Pearson, he murmured. I won't let you down. Alicia allowed a small smile. That's what I want to hear. Let's work on making this place the best it can be for everyone. He nodded, a glimmer of hope finally replacing his initial defensiveness. As he rose to leave, Alicia watched him, wondering if this experience would truly mark a turning point for him. She knew change didn't come easily, and the journey ahead would be challenging, not just for Brian, but for the entire team she'd inherited. When she returned to the dining area, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She scanned the room, seeing each table, each guest, and each server through a sharper lens. Le Couron had its flaws, yes, but it also held potential, a potential she was determined to unlock, no matter the obstacles. As she left the restaurant that night, Alicia felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Tonight had been a beginning, a glimpse into the work that lay ahead and a reminder of the standards she intended to uphold. In her mind, she envisioned the future of Le Couron, a place where every guest would feel welcome and every employee would embody the respect and kindness that true hospitality demanded. Days after her visit to Le Couron, Alicia returned to the restaurant with a determined focus. This time, she was in full business attire, sleek, tailored, her presence unmistakably authoritative. The staff greeted her with hushed whispers and subtle glances, clearly still shaken from her previous encounter with Brian. Today marked the beginning of her planned transformation for the restaurant, starting with a team meeting that she hoped would set a new tone. She'd arranged for all staff to meet in the private dining area, which felt strangely intimate now that the tables were pushed aside and chairs had been arranged in a circle. As the team gathered, Alicia took a moment to observe them, noting both the familiar faces and the nervous energy in the room. John stood by her side, looking slightly apprehensive but supportive. Brian lingered at the back, shoulders slouched, hands jammed into his pockets, his face unreadable. "Thank you all for being here," Alicia began, her voice calm but firm. "I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about some changes we'll be making here at Le Couronne. As many of you know, this isn't just an investment for me. This place represents something personal, something important, and I'm committed to making it a place we can all be proud of." A few employees nodded, while others remained silent, listening intently. "Some of you may have seen me here the other night, dressed more casually," she continued, "and you might have noticed the way I was treated. It wasn't what I'd hoped to experience from my own team." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, her gaze sweeping over each staff member. "I'll be straightforward," Alicia said. "Respect is non-negotiable here. This restaurant should be a place where every guest, no matter their background, their attire, or their appearance, is treated with the same courtesy and warmth. I know that may sound basic, but it's a standard we haven't always met." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on the floor. "To make sure we're all on the same page, I'll be implementing training sessions focused on respect, inclusivity, and professionalism," Alicia announced. "These sessions aren't optional. They're a chance for all of us to realign with the vision I have for Le Couronne." John cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Ms. Pearson and I will be working together to oversee these changes," he added, his voice confident. "We're here to support each of you through this transition. If anyone has questions or concerns, please feel free to approach us." There was a brief silence before one of the servers, a young woman named Mia, raised her hand hesitantly. "Miss Pearson, can I say something?" Alicia nodded, encouraging her. "Of course, Mia. Please." Mia glanced nervously around the room before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I think these changes are a good thing. I mean, I've been here for 2 years, and sometimes it felt like there was a lot of judgment, you know? Like if someone didn't look a certain way, they weren't as welcome." Her voice trailed off, but Alicia nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Thank you for sharing that, Mia. You're exactly right, and it's precisely why we're having this conversation now. I want every employee here to know that they're part of this change, that they have a voice." Mia offered a small, grateful smile, her relief evident. Alicia could see the ripple of agreement among some of the younger staff members, while others exchanged wary glances, unsure of what this new direction would mean. Then, in a surprising turn, Brian raised his hand slowly, drawing Alicia's attention. She could sense the reluctance in his posture, but he seemed to force himself to speak up. "Ms. Pearson," he began, his tone uneasy. I wanted to say that I appreciate the chance to stay on. I know I messed up, and I know I have some things to work on." Alicia held his gaze, nodding. "Thank you, Brian. I respect that you're willing to acknowledge it. Change isn't easy, especially when it requires us to question our own assumptions. But I believe that with the right effort, we can all make this place better." Brian looked down, a faint hint of relief crossing his face. Alicia could see the flicker of vulnerability there, a small sign that perhaps he was open to change. As the meeting continued, Alicia outlined her vision for Le Couronne, speaking openly about her desire for it to become a space of inclusion, a place where guests and staff alike felt a sense of belonging. She described the training sessions in detail, the workshops on empathy and respect, and encouraged the team to voice their thoughts and ideas. After the meeting, Alicia spent time talking individually with staff members, sensing both their enthusiasm and their apprehension. Some, like Mia, seemed eager for the changes, while others were more reserved, waiting to see if Alicia's promises would truly take root. By the time the last employee had left, Alicia felt a sense of cautious optimism. She knew this was only the beginning and that true transformation would take time. But for the first time since acquiring Le Couronne, she felt the foundations of her vision starting to take hold. As she prepared to leave, John approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well, Alicia," he said, his tone warm with respect. "I think the team respects you, and for what it's worth, I do too." Alicia smiled, touched by his words. "Thank you, John. I know it's going to be a challenge, but I think we're on the right track." John nodded, his gaze steady. "Change is hard, but it's what this place needs. And, I'll admit, even I've had to question a few of my own assumptions." It's easy to get comfortable to let things slide. I'm glad you're here to shake things up." They shared a brief, understanding smile before Alicia turned toward the entrance, her mind racing with plans and possibilities for the future of Le Couron. She could still feel the weight of the work that lay ahead, but she was no longer alone in it. As she stepped outside into the brisk night air, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was building something new, a place that could become a reflection of her values, a testament to the power of respect and dignity. And as she walked down the street, she couldn't help but feel that, despite the obstacles, she was exactly where she was meant to be.